This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
This is The World Today, 15 minutes of the top news from around the world. I am Peninah Karibe in Nairobi. The headlines. Spotlight on limiting global warming as leaders gather for a UN climate conference in Glasgow. Mediation efforts seek way forward in Sudan after anti-military protests. And Taliban Supreme Leader Akhundzada makes first public appearance in Afghanistan. The 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, has opened in Glasgow, Scotland. The event runs through to November 12th. It will see intense diplomatic negotiations by almost 200 countries aimed at speeding up the global response to global warming. At Sunday's session, UN Climate Chief Patricia Espinosa said the task of swiftly shifting the world's economy onto a greener trajectory to avoid increasingly deadly climate impacts was enormously difficult. In Glasgow, world leaders face demands to limit global warming as the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, gets underway. Let's get some more details from John Bever.
Well, today is all about the World Leaders Summit. For the next 2 days, we have leaders from across the world attending either in person or virtually. And we have something in the region of 25,000 delegates here as well. Now, they are all meeting to try and come up with some firm promises. Also expect to hear more about what rich countries can do to help poorer countries. This magic figure of $100 billion that's needed annually for richer countries to help poorer countries decarbonise their economies. Expect more on that. Everyone admitting at the moment that they are failing on that target. So people really want some firm promises, and expect to hear a lot today about moving away from petrol and diesel cars to electric and fighting deforestation, and in fact going the other way and the world needing to plant more trees. A lot of people who are unhappy that governments aren't doing enough at the moment. That really is the main focus. Obviously every special activist group has got a different focus, but generally the feeling is that, especially among some of the world leaders who are here today, we're looking at people like the UK, America, India, Brazil, those sorts of people. A lot of people worried that they are not doing enough. The UK is trying to lead the forefront. It is seeing itself as trying to position itself as a world leader on climate change. It's using the fact that the summit is taking place behind me here in Glasgow to really try and get ahead in terms of those policies. But lots of the protesters here unhappy that not enough is being done. There are somewhere in the region of 10,000 police here from across the UK. They are taking security very seriously, but we're expecting tens of thousands of protesters over this week.
And joining us now is Steve Nichols, Head of Environment at National Business Initiative. He joins us via Zoom from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Leaders attending this summit, especially from vulnerable countries, will be looking for stronger commitments by richer countries. What kind of outcomes are expected from COP26?
So the key things that we need to watch for are outcomes related to finance and support, particularly for developing countries. And that support is not limited to just finance, but things related to capacity building, preferential trade, sharing of intellectual property, and then critically any market mechanisms or anything related to carbon pricing are critical for economic development. But then also we need to think very carefully about agreements related to adaptation, given that Africa in particular is one of the most vulnerable continents to the physical impact of climate change. How we respond to those physical impacts and the kind of support that we get is important. And in relation to that, any agreements on loss and damage. In other words, how do developing countries get compensated by developed countries who have been doing damage to the environment for a long period?
Now, despite much talk of climate change efforts, the world remains on track for a dangerous global temperature rise. Do we need more ambitious goals to achieve what the world needs to achieve?
We need much more ambitious goals. So the latest assessment of the science conducted by the IPCC in their sixth assessment report concludes that climate change is certainly man-made. and that in order to avoid the worst impact of climate change, we need to be able to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, which is more ambitious than the current 2 degrees embodied in the Paris Agreement. And so we need that ratchet of ambition. And in order to do that, we need to be net neutral by 2050. In other words, no more carbon emissions after 2050. But also we need a global reduction of carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. That's just 9 years away. So we need to be far more ambitious. Not only do we need bolder commitments, but we need bolder action. And we need to start now.
Yeah, and speaking of that bolder action, we've had so many climate talks this year, a lot of commitments made, yet not much on climate cash flow, particularly for climate vulnerable countries. Why?
Well, so this is the key, and embedded in a whole bunch of additional things that are happening around the world, the impacts of COVID. And so the key question that we need to be watching is how will this finance be made available? And in particular to developing countries from developed countries who have made these commitments and promises in previous agreements. But just as importantly, African countries in particular need to be very clear about where we need the support. And so that requires a whole bunch of financial planning, as well as sort of physical economic planning. What will be financed by when? What kind of preferential finance and trade do we need to enable those investments? And that then in turn requires some additional support from developed countries around capacity building and how do we go about doing that planning. But in particular, I think something that we really need to focus on more urgently is how do we as African countries work together to share knowledge and expertise and be able to direct that finance in much more useful ways.
Steve Nichols in Johannesburg, thank you very much for your time. Australia's Prime Minister says his country is already delivering when it comes to reaching emissions targets, but a new report disagrees. It says Australia is the worst climate performer among the world's developed countries. Greg Navarro reports from Sydney.
Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison's announcement of his government's new climate targets included a pamphlet and his endorsement.
Our plan for net zero by 2050 is the plan that I believe Australians want, because it gets it right.
In accordance with Standing Order.
The plan is the result of a last-minute deal reached between parties in Morrison's coalition government just days before the start of the climate summit in Glasgow. It's largely based on current and yet-to-be-built technologies.
Now, these technologies can work in particular situations, but by and large, for the kinds of energy production that we require for large cities, for the kind of energy we need now, it's not going to work.
And a growing chorus of domestic and international critics contend the plan lacks details and any new policies.
As Australians and our government are already taking action on climate change, and we're already delivering.
A report released just days earlier by the Climate Council of Australia argues otherwise.
Australia's been trailing the rest of the world for a long time now, and we are the worst performer among developed countries. This is looking both at our track record in reducing emissions, also our commitments going forwards.
Scientists will tell you that Australia not only has a global responsibility to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, it's also a big part of the problem, especially when you consider that its domestic emissions combined with the emissions from the fossil fuels it exports puts it near the top of the list of the world's biggest carbon polluters. The government's net zero plan does not include a more ambitious 2030 target, which many of Australia's allies have pledged to achieve. Scientists say Australia is experiencing more climate-fueled weather extremes than most developed nations, including the 2019-2020 deadly black summer bushfires, droughts, and heat waves.
Extreme heat in Australia kills more people than any other natural disaster put together. So these impacts are very real and they're very immediate.
Macquarie University Associate Professor Paul Beggs is the lead author of a report that looks at Australia's exposure to climate change from a human health perspective.
So it's not only the extreme climate events like tropical cyclones, heat waves and so on, but there are many indirect impacts of climate change on human health, so impacts of poor air pollution, vector-borne diseases, things like dengue and Ross River virus here in Australia.
Beggs says those impacts to human health are very real and will only get worse without strong action in the next decade. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Let's head to Sudan, where the situation remains tense as the military remains in control of the country. A South Sudanese delegation is in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, to mediate between military generals and civilian leaders. Meanwhile, Sudan State Television reported that Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has dismissed the public prosecutor. On Sunday, the UN Special Representative to Sudan met with ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok at his residence, where he remains under house arrest. Volker Perthes says he has discussed the options for mediation and the way forward for Sudan. Meanwhile, Sudanese Teachers Committee said they will strike starting Monday against the military takeover last week. Anti-military protests have been ongoing since the military seized control in October. According to Sudan Doctors Committee, at least 11 people have been killed since the protests began. The Taliban say their supreme leader, Haibatullah Akhundzada, addressed supporters in the southern Afghan city of Kandahar on Saturday. It appears to be his first public appearance since taking control of the group in 2016, but no footage or pictures of him have been released.
His visit made us very happy. All the students and teachers welcomed his visit.
He is the leader of Afghanistan. He's in Afghan territory at any time, and he has the right to meet any Afghans, talking to them and hearing from them.
Taliban social media accounts shared a 10-minute audio recording. In it, Akhundzada does not touch on political organization, but seeks God's blessings for the Taliban leadership. Akhundzada has long kept a low profile. His public profile has largely been limited to the release of messages during Islamic holidays. China Media Group's reporter has contacted the religious school Akhundzada reportedly visited. The school confirmed that he was there Saturday, delivered a speech, and greeted some 700 to 800 students. And that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent and Africa Live. Thanks for watching.
Taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Over the last 14 hours of rain.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
As leaders attend the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow, what are Africa's priority areas? Mediation efforts seek way forward in Sudan after anti-military protests. And a traditional ceremony in Benin brings together dozens of twins to be honored as deities. This is Africa Live. Thank you for joining us. I am Peninah Karibe. Also coming up, tourism revenues in Tunisia rise 7% in October as the nation aims to attract tourists from China. And South Africa's Mamelodi Sundowns ladies team set for historic debut in the African Champions League. What leaders are gathering in Glasgow in a bid to ramp up the response to global warming. Over 120 heads of state and government are attending the 26th UN Climate Change Conference. Leaders from India, France, Australia and the US are among those expected to address this summit in person, while Chinese President Xi Jinping will make his remarks in the form of a written statement. The conference comes at a time when the world has gone through a series of climate change-related weather disasters, from severe flooding to wildfires. In Glasgow, world leaders face demands to limit global warming as the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, gets underway. Let's get some more details from John Bevere.
Well, today is all about the World Leaders Summit. For the next 2 days, we have leaders from across the world attending either in person or virtually. And we have something in the region of 25,000 delegates here as well. Now, they are all meeting to try and come up with some firm promises. Also expect to hear more about what rich countries can do to help poorer countries. This magic figure of $100 billion that's needed annually for richer countries to help poorer countries decarbonise their economies. Expect more on that. Everyone admitting at the moment that they are failing on that target. So people really want some firm promises, and expect to hear a lot today about moving away from petrol and diesel cars to electric and fighting deforestation, and in fact going the other way and the world needing to plant more trees. A lot of people who are unhappy that governments aren't doing enough at the moment. That really is the main focus. Obviously every special activist group has got a different focus, but generally the feeling is that, especially among some of the world leaders who are here today, we're looking at people like the UK, America, India, Brazil, those sorts of people. A lot of people worried that they are not doing enough. The UK is trying to lead the forefront. It is seeing itself as trying to position itself as a world leader on climate change. It's using the fact that the summit is taking place behind me here in Glasgow to really try and get ahead in terms of those policies. But lots of the protesters here unhappy that not enough is being done. There are somewhere in the region of 10,000 police here from across the UK. They are taking security very seriously, but we're expecting tens of thousands of protesters over this week.
All right, so let's discuss these issues further. We bring in Phil Haza live for us in Abuja and Adil Mahroui live from Cairo. Phil, let me begin with you. Climate change there in Nigeria has led to seasons of drought and excess floods. What are Nigeria's key priorities as the COP26 summit kicks off?
Well, yes, in Nigeria, it's been I mean, the impact of climate change has been very well felt. There's a report, actually, that in 2020, at least 80% of farmers were affected by drought and flooding across the country. Just in Niger State, for example, over 32,000 farmers were affected by flooding sometime last year. So it really tells you that there's a huge effect or impact of climate change in Nigeria, especially in the agricultural sector. There's also the focus of developing the socioeconomic space, because the lack of infrastructure is also one of the key areas where if you are not very well prepared for climate change, you will be affected. And so I believe that that's some of the effects rather of climate change really on agriculture, and of course in health, the health sector, because we also saw this year and last year an increase in cases of cholera, malaria, and all of that is as a result of the change in weather conditions, heat, extreme weather conditions like extreme heat and cold in different parts of the country. Of course, the pandemic has also had a setback on the efforts to tackle climate change.
Adel, coming to you, Egypt's large population makes it extremely vulnerable to climate change. What are some of the country's concerns?
Well, Egypt, because of the population of about 100 million, they live on only 7% of the Egyptian mainland, and that means that there is a high urban condensations and densities, which in turn is spiking up in some areas of the country the emissions, especially when we talk about carbon emissions from transportation and from industrial activities as well. And because of that, Cairo, for instance, has one of the most polluted cities in the world, and there are many environmental challenges. And in terms of global warming and climate change, the impact extends to hurt the Egyptians in their economy. It affects greatly agriculture, affects also tourism, as it affects the marine life, and therefore there's a vicious cycle of the impact of environment on Egypt's economy. And therefore the country is trying to do its own, not just waiting for the industrial powers to take steps, but also taking its own measures to decrease as much as possible the impact of human activity on its own climate. So for instance, within the coming 2 to 3 decades, Egypt plans to expand the population urban life from 7% to 14%, to double the space, so to diffuse and decrease the density of people living. Also, government has been trying to manage the impact of climate change on its economy by having environmental challenges and environmental activities to take more responsibility, and creating government bodies that will be responsible for that.
All right, so Phil, coming back to you, what progress has Nigeria made in its transition to a low-carbon economy?
Well, quite a number of progress has been made. So there's a report that suggests that Nigeria has made at least 25% reduction of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, from 1990 to 2014. And of course, we know that in 2017, the government validated the Paris Agreement and also pledged to reduce that further by 20% in 2030. But of course, with a clause of 45% support from the international community. That's in terms of provision of funds, infrastructure, and all of that, because for you to actually go ahead to reduce, for example, gas flaring and all of that, you require a lot of infrastructural support to rechannel the gas for maybe household use and all of that, which is one thing that the government has committed to doing, to see how that rather than flare the gas from, the oil producing areas, they'll be able to convert it to household usage. But of course, we know that in Nigeria, the country still is responsible for 19% of greenhouse gas emissions in the whole of Africa, and that's still a huge figure. And so one of the key areas that the government will be looking at, or rather the president and his, the ones that accompany the people, authorities that are accompanying him to the COP26, will be to focus on, grants, funds from the international community to see how that they can support the country to tackle this climate change issue. Because if you must know, Africa as a whole contributes just about 4% of greenhouse emissions to the world, but yet the climate change effect, the brunt of it, is felt more by the continent. And that's because, of course, the socioeconomic development is still very low, and they're not well prepared for the effect of climate change.
Adel, President Al-Sisi has in the past spoken of the need for equity in international responsibility to combat global warming. And you've already mentioned some of the steps that Egypt is taking thus far in terms of moving to green energy. But talk to us more about that.
Well, the government is investing heavily in supporting green energy. There have been initiatives to support any industry or any transportation organization or vehicle producer to import, for example, any sorts of parts or import electric-based or electric power vehicles to cut, for example, taxes, for instance, or customs. All of Egypt's new cities that is part of the urban expansion the country is leading will be strictly regulating or allowing only electric vehicles to operate. That mainly goes for the new administrative capital, which is one of the biggest urban projects that Egypt is undergoing momentarily. Also shifting to a massive production to encourage solar farms and wind farms across the country, giving them incentive to boost up and make sure that at least electric power will be greatly produced by renewable energy in general. So these are part of the activities that is going. Also, there are research that is taking place. As you know, the Red Sea has, as the climate change in general and the global warming impact that it has, corals, for instance, across the world are dying because of the increasing of temperature in water levels. In the Red Sea, however, scientists have discovered heat-resistant corals. So Egypt is trying to join such research so that not only the country will be protecting itself, but will be engaging in supporting the world effort to revive and maintain biodiversity and any natural impact that takes place because of global warming.
All right, Adel, thank you very much for that. Adel Makri live for us in Cairo. And from Abuja, Phil Ihaza, thank you both for joining us. Rebel forces from the Tigray People's Liberation Front are claiming that they are now in control of the key cities of Dessie and Kombolcha in the Amhara region. The announcement comes as the federal government continues launching airstrikes on Tigray. The latest airstrike was on the region's capital, Mekelle, where the government said they had successfully hit a site used by Tigrayan forces to make and repair weapons. However, sources in Tigray report that 10 people were reported dead after the incident, including 3 children.
The Ethiopian government has just announced that an airstrike in and around Mekelle city has been held, and the target was Agula Training Center. According to the government, that area has been used by the rebel group for training and other purposes, and that has been the target. And the military said it has successfully hit the target. On the other hand, we know that war has continued in different parts of the Amhara regional state against government force. The TPLF force are saying that they are gaining some lands, and the government is also claiming that it is really getting triumph here and there. But we can confirm that war really has continued.
In Sudan, the situation remains tense as military remains in control of the country. A South Sudanese delegation is in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, to mediate between military generals and civilian leaders. Meanwhile, Sudan State Television reported that Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has dismissed the public prosecutor. On Sunday, the UN Special Representative to Sudan met with ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok at his residence, where he remains under house arrest. Walker Peters says he has discussed the options for mediation and the way forward for Sudan. Meanwhile, Sudanese Teachers Committee said they will strike starting Monday against the military takeover last week. Anti-military protests have been ongoing since the military seized control in October. Sudan Doctors Committee said at least 11 people have been killed since the protests began. For the latest, we're now joined by Naba Muhyiddin from Khartoum. Naba, the Teachers Committee had said they will strike on Monday. Have they delivered on this? What's the situation right now?
Yes, actually the schools are closed, but it's not very clear that due to the strike or due to the current circumstances, like the inaccessibility for children and their parents for schools, the absence of the government, there is no government formed yet, and so if there is no government, there is no directives for the schools to open or to close. But we can say, like, yes, there is a strike, but there is also other circumstances make it so difficult to know whether this strike is successful or the other circumstances, like the closure of the roads and the difficulty of the movement and the absence of the government and directives, because the government is not formed yet and the previous government was just dissolved. And also there is other things to consider, like the fragile situation. Most of the parents cannot risk taking their children to the schools, and also the shortages of fuel make it so difficult for school transportation to take the children, and the bread shortages that has already impacted the school's hours, where they were cut to 3 or 4 hours 2 weeks ago. So there is a lot of circumstances and conditions make it so difficult to know whether this strike is successful, or like a mix of conditions make the school is still closed.
Right. We also know there's a South Sudanese delegation that arrived in Khartoum for mediation. Tell us more about efforts in the country to resolve the current crisis.
Actually, the efforts are less than if you compare the efforts with the crisis, it's under the predictions, because the crisis is really big and is really threatening the security situation in the country, with the political parties want to negotiate and military generals refuse to negotiate, and the protesters are defined for democracy. So the situation is really foggy and unclear. But there is some efforts by businessmen and by independent characters independent characters, and also South Sudan want to mediate, and UN officials have met also the Prime Minister, the ousted Prime Minister, and the military generals. But it seems like there is a deadlock. There is no talks going on after 1 week of the military takeover and after the escalation by the pro-democracy protesters. The situation is freezing, like nothing is going on, but Sudanese are putting great hopes on the international community to save what could be saved. But right now, the talks are not very successful. For instance, Freedom and Change Forces, which is the alliance that backed the protests against the ousted President al-Bashir, formed 3 committees to discuss and to make talks with the generals. But news confirmed that the generals refuse to talk to them, because it's so obvious that the generals take over the transitional period, so they will not talk to them before international efforts are made to make it successful. So yes, the efforts are still less than the expected, and the crisis is still growing in the country.
All right, Naba Muhyiddin, we appreciate the update. Thank you very much. And for more analysis on this, let's bring in Tembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow, Africa-Asia Dialogues. He joins us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. So mediation efforts by the international community and within Sudan had been announced before Saturday's protest, with no outcome reported. What will it take to resolve the current standoff?
Well, I think there are 2 standoffs right now. One is the standoff that insists on the reinstallation of the civil part of the government. As you know, the Sovereign Council considered of both military and the civilians. So there's that one standoff. But there's another standoff taking place in Sudan, which is people actually wanting the government to dissolve the Sovereign Council. Many of those people have been calling for it to dissolve because of lack of delivery of the promises that they've made, including the resuscitation of the economy. So it's quite complicated at the moment. I think what will probably solve this is the election. We know that Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has announced that it's going to be in July 2023, but they might be compelled to push the elections forward. But of course, the chances are, as I've said before, that if that was to happen, you are likely to find a military-backed party winning those elections, because they happen to be the most organized at the moment within the political fraternity in Sudan.
And yet there's been a proposal to hand back executive powers to the former Prime Minister Hamdok. Do you see the military agreeing to this?
I don't think the military will agree to it, but we must remember again that the Sovereign Council was an interim government. It was not a permanent government. So even if you were to hand over to Abdallah Hamdok, chances are he has to call for elections as soon as he resumed the power. I think the belief at the moment in Sudan, strangely, is that there is an assumption that Abdallah Hamdok was an elected leader, but he was not an elected leader. He he was chosen by the people, the civilian part of the government, to represent them within the government. So we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen. But I don't see any way out of the current quagmire except for the military to call for early elections, different from the timeline that was already set by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan of July 2023. They'll have to push the elections forward.
We've seen a group of loyalists of ousted leader Omar al-Bashir released by the military. What's your reading of this, and how will it affect the transition process, if at all?
Well, there is a move, of course, to prompt up the support of Omar al-Bashir, including the current two leaders who are heading the military at the moment, which is Mohammed Hamdan Hamdok and Abdel Fattah Burhan. All of these people are actually, they stand accused of violations of human rights, particularly the most powerful at the moment, which is Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti. And Omar al-Bashir is supposed to be facing the International Court of Justice for the alleged crimes. And there's been an argument that if he has to go and face those crimes, these two leaders who are currently the military leaders in Sudan will have to join, because they were part and parcel of his army when those atrocities occurred. Hemeti, for example, was the leader of the Janjaweed. So there is a move now to try and rectify the balance of powers. Those who supported Omar al-Bashir insisting that they mustn't be sent to The Hague and there must be a new political setup in Sudan, all with the intention of ensuring that those that stand accused of crimes against humanity, past crimes against humanity, are saved and protected from facing the music at The Hague.
Tembisa Fakude, thank you for your time. You're watching Africa Live. Let's take a short break. Coming up, Egypt warns delaying Libyan polls will affect peace and stability. And a traditional ceremony in Benin brings together dozens of twins to be honored as deities. Chinese President Xi Jinping's remarks at the 16th G20 Leaders Summit via video link have been well received in Zambia. Secretary General of People's Alliance for Change in Zambia commends Xi's call to make fight against COVID-19 and global economic recovery a shared responsibility.
The world has been devastated because of the coronavirus pandemic. We have seen that most economies across the world have been almost, reduced to nothing, especially in Africa. Zambia is that particular example that we can point to. A lot of businesses were affected during the corona from 2019 up to early this year when we had the third wave. Yeah, but I think picking from what His Excellency Jinping did allude to during the speech yesterday, I think it's very, very important that as the nations fight this pandemic, there is need for collaboration. We need to come together and begin to do things together.
Egypt has warned about the consequences of delaying the Libyan election. The concerns were raised in a meeting between the Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry and the UN Secretary General Special Envoy to Libya, Jan Kubis. The duo met in Cairo ahead of an ongoing 5+5 Joint Military Commission conference, which includes representatives from Sudan, Niger and Chad. More details with CGTN's Adel Mahroui from the Egyptian capital.
As the deadline to hold Libya's general elections on December 24 approaches, Egypt's concerns are growing. In a meeting between the Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry and UN envoy Jan Kubis, Cairo warned about the efforts some in Libya are leading to postpone the vote. Sameh Shukri reiterated that delaying the elections will have negative consequences on Libya's stability and security.
There is good exchange of information between Egypt and the UN, but there must be more cooperation in many fields. There are many challenges facing the elections. None of those current named candidates, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, Haftar, Aquila Saleh, or Bashaga, represent all of Libyan people, and there are no guarantees over the integrity of the whole elections.
During the meeting, Egypt renewed its calls to end all forms of foreign intervention in domestic affairs of its western neighbor. A foreign ministry statement said that the continuous presence of foreign fighters, quote, represents a clear threat to Libya's sovereignty.
Libya is facing a huge problem. So far, the evacuation plan of foreign fighters has not been settled yet. Libyans still need to agree on a way to implement that. Given the current circumstances, I can't imagine Libya holding elections. How can Libyans cast their votes while armed groups in many regions are threatening the democratic process?
From his side, Kubish updated the Egyptian foreign minister with the latest communications he held with countries concerned with the Libyan crisis. He also stressed that the withdrawal of mercenaries and foreign fighters from Libya must take place in a way that would not have a destabilizing effect on the country. Shukri and Kubish met before Cairo saw the launch of a three-day conference that brings representatives from Egypt, Sudan, Chad and Niger with Libya's 5+5 Joint Military Commission. Together with the UN, they aim at finalizing a plan that sees countries help in receiving fighters or mercenaries in Libya. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
In Benin, twins are not just considered as your regular bundles of joy. Many see them as gods and believe twins can bring good or bad luck depending on how they are treated. CGTN's Wanja Mungai brings us the story of a special ceremony by a voodoo priestess.
It's a happy day here in Abomey-Calavi, a city in Benin. They call it the Voodoo Twin Ceremony to honor the twins.
I thought of such a celebration to honor the twins, to honor them as we honor deities, just as we implore other deities.
Both living and dead twins are equally revered and treated as demigods. These Beninese people believe that their fortune or misfortune depends on how their society treats the twins.
La bénédiction, le progrès.
Blessings, improvement, total success. I have come for them to pray for me, for all the twins here to be with me, for my family to be well, for my business to work, for total success, for joy in my family.
For the dead twins, the Beninese people still consider them as part of the society.
When there is a miscarriage, we say they went back to the forest to look for wood. So it's important to represent them as a divinity. This is where the spirit is. The spirit of the divinity is represented. It is the spirit of the divinity which is represented that we worship.
These wooden hearts are said to host the spirits of those gone to the forest to fetch firewood. Parents are expected to pamper the dolls, and failure to do so might attract bad luck.
These are not practices. They are not things. They are gods on earth. When we believe in them, we take them seriously. They bring happiness, prosperity, wealth. We are not lacking in anything. You just have to believe.
These rituals are popular not only in Benin, but in neighboring Togo and Nigeria. Antonia prides herself in honoring the twins and hopes that her offerings of money will be accepted. Wanja Mungai, CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
The The World Trade Organization is tackling a vaccine supply shortage by attempting to reduce restrictions on the export of vaccines. It's also trying to get manufacturers to decentralize their production. WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala says that there are gaps in the international response to possible future pandemics from a lack of a global network and slowness to find solutions, particularly in poor countries.
Put in global governance, bring out the money to help finance this, especially helping poor countries. We are also saying the poor countries should spend 1% more of their GDP on strengthening their own health systems, so they too have to contribute. Now, I think we need the political will to have this adopted. If we miss this opportunity to prepare for the next pandemic, our children will not forgive us, because now we know the lessons, and we need to learn those lessons. So I'm hoping that the leaders will, have that political will to adopt some of these recommendations for the next pandemic.
The Central Bank of Egypt said that Egypt's balance of payments recorded an overall surplus of $1.9 billion in the fiscal year 2020-2021 against a deficit of $8.6 billion a year earlier in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. The balance of payments is the difference between expenses and revenue in a country's transactions with the external world. From Cairo, Yasser Hakim looks at the reasons for this positive turnaround in the North African country and expectations for the upcoming year.
Egypt saw a considerable drop in main sources of revenue during the pandemic year in tourism, exports, tax collection and foreign direct investments. The result was a deficit of $8.6 billion. But unlike many other developing nations, the North African country has quickly recovered from the $8.6 billion deficit to post a $1.9 billion surplus in 1 year, even exceeding pre-pandemic levels. Net inflow has mushroomed from $5.4 billion to $23.4 billion.
The state is working on 2,524 agricultural and industrial projects which help reduce balance of payments deficit. Another reason is the rise in stock capital inflow to $18.4 billion, which is a main chunk of the $23.4 billion inflow. In addition to other sources, most important are remittances from Egyptian exports, which has increased by more than 13% than last year. We also have a steady improvement in the petroleum trade and balance, which kept expenses down.
But with the recent surge in international energy prices leading to an acute global recession derail Egypt's recovery efforts, some experts are not worried.
Yes, there is a big probability that it would affect the balance of payments, but we expect this will last for only about 6 months, and the impact should be minimal, because one of our advantages is that we have become an oil and natural gas producer and exporter. That will limit the negative effects a bit.
Analysts also believe the deficit is caused by a drop in tourism revenue and foreign direct investments, which will soon pick up again, predicting balance of payments surplus to even grow further in 2022. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Tunisia's new Minister of Tourism and Handicrafts has announced that tourism revenues went up 7% from January 1st to October 2021 compared to the same period in 2020. Authorities in Tunis say the Chinese market will be given priority in the North African country because it's one of the most promising source markets in the world. Adnan Shawashi reports.
Mohammed Muaz Belhassan said the number of overnight stays has increased by nearly 19%, while the number of arrivals grew 3% in October. Many countries have removed Tunisia from the red list following the improvement of the health situation in the North African nation.
There are positive indicators on the resumption of tourism activities. The traditional markets are returning to Tunisia. The British, German and Russian markets are very important. They are back after more than 18 months of absence due to travel restrictions. Now all actors in the tourism industry have a clear vision about this sector's future.
The minister declared that Tunisia aims to attract more than 100,000 Chinese tourists. The tourism department is training thousands of Tunisian tourism professionals in order to welcome travelers from China.
The Chinese market is one of the most promising and strategic markets for Tunisia's tourism industry. We are training local guides and tourism professionals who speak Chinese and know the needs of tourists from China. Chinese travelers visit Tunisia to discover its culture, heritage and civilization. They are always welcome in this country.
The tourism recovery has revived the handicraft sector in the country. This sector employs tens of thousands of craftsmen and craftswomen in Tunisia.
Tunisian craftsmen have resumed normal activity as more travelers and tourists are visiting the country's inner regions to discover and buy our items. The lockdown paralyzed this sector. Now we're optimistic.
The Tunisian government is working on the revision of the legal framework governing the tourism sector. This project aims to encourage investment dedicated to alternative tourism and to boost regional development in inner regions. Experts assert that the gradual recovery of the tourism activity after the COVID-19 crisis will help in preserving more than 400,000 direct and indirect jobs in Tunisia. Tunisian authorities adopted several economic, social and fiscal measures during the health crisis to guarantee the sustainability of the tourism industry. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
And coming up in sports, South Africa's Mamelodi Sundowns ladies team set for historic debut in the African Champions League.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
South African women's football champions Mamelodi Sundowns are on a mission to emulate their male counterparts and add a star to their bright yellow jersey. But the ladies from Johannesburg will need to be at their best to see off the best Africa has to offer in the inaugural CAF Women's Champions League tournament in Egypt. CGTN's Sias Duplessis has more.
Jerry Chabalala's team of talented footballers have not tasted defeat in all competitions since 2018. They are South Africa's #1 club team and head into the first ever CAF Champions League tournament for women, eager to show that their record has been earned through hard work and by playing quality football.
We're not only representing South Africa, we're representing the SADC region, but we don't want to put ourselves under pressure. We'll take one game at a time. We know what is expected of us. We need to go out there and make history, but we're not playing football to become history makers. But we're just going there to win each and every single game that we play. If us winning all the games, it means we're going to make history. Let it be.
Inspirational captain Zanele Nhlapo, who returned from Europe a season ago to lead Banyana Bastille, says she's incredibly proud of her team and knows that they have a responsibility to inspire young women all over the Rainbow Nation.